The Aleutian Islands stretched like a forgotten edge of the world, jagged black ridges rising from a churning gray sea. Fog clung to the rocks, thick and cold, and the wind screamed across the barren landscape as if carrying the voices of some ancient storm. In early June 1942, a small American reconnaissance plane skimmed low over Dutch Harbor, its engines straining against the gusts. On board, Lieutenant Robert Harris clutched the controls, staring down at the harbor below, where smoke still rose from the Japanese bombardment of the night before. Buildings lay in ruins, docks splintered, and a few American soldiers moved like ghosts through the wreckage, firing blindly at anything that moved. Harris swallowed the lump in his throat and whispered a prayer to himself, though he had never been a religious man. This was Alaska, a place where the war had arrived silently, carried on the icy wind, and yet left scars that would never be seen by the world beyond the Pacific. On the ground, Sergeant James Calloway wiped rain from his brow, the fabric of his uniform soaked through, mud clinging to his boots as he scrambled over debris. He had been stationed in Alaska for months, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He had seen combat before, in training and in the newsreels, but the Aleutians were different. The Japanese had taken Attu and Kiska, and the Americans were determined to reclaim them. Yet the enemy was as elusive as the fog that never lifted. Calloway crouched behind a shell-shattered wall, listening to the distant roar of artillery and the occasional gunshot echoing across the cove. He checked his map, tracing the coastline, noting where supply lines had been destroyed, where reinforcements might appear. Every movement of the wind seemed to carry a threat. Every shadow might conceal an enemy soldier. Yet amidst the tension, there was a quiet beauty to the place, a rugged isolation, the smell of salt and rain, the endless expanse of sea meeting sky. Lieutenant Harris landed on a makeshift airstrip, the tires crunching on the black volcanic gravel, and climbed out, shivering against the wind. He looked up at the cliffs and thought of the men who had already fallen, their names lost in the fog of war. He walked toward the command post, passing soldiers who nodded silently, too exhausted to speak. Colonel Robert Lawson was waiting, hunched over a map table in a canvas tent, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "We've got to move quickly," Lawson said, pointing to the narrow ridge that connected the cliffs to the interior of Attu. "The Japanese are fortified, but they aren't expecting an attack through the fog. Use it to your advantage." Harris nodded. The plan was risky, almost reckless, but there was no other choice. In this forgotten corner of the world, hesitation meant death. As the Americans advanced, the Aleutians revealed their unforgiving nature. Snow melted into mud that swallowed boots. Rivers swelled with rainfall, and the wind cut like a knife across exposed faces. Every step forward was a battle against the elements as well as the enemy. Calloway and his squad moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, hearts pounding in rhythm with the distant artillery. The fog rolled in, thick as wool, hiding the terrain and amplifying the sounds of distant combat. Then a sudden explosion shook the ground. Japanese artillery had found them. Men dove for cover, mud splattering over their helmets and faces, bullets whistling past like angry hornets. Calloway fired back blindly, trusting instinct, training, and luck. Hours felt like days. Time stretched and twisted in the fog and rain, each moment a test of endurance and courage. Night brought no relief. The wind carried the cries of the wounded and the whistle of distant gunfire. Soldiers huddled in makeshift trenches, the earth beneath them saturated, cold seeping into their bones. They shared stories in whispers, small fragments of home, fleeting memories to keep the mind tethered to sanity. Harris wrote in his journal, the pages damp and smeared, recording the positions of the enemy, the morale of his men, and the unforgiving landscape. He wrote not to be read but to survive, to give form to the chaos surrounding them. Across the ridge, Japanese soldiers huddled in similar trenches, equally exhausted, equally determined. Neither side fully understood the land, yet both had learned to fear it, respect it, and hate it in equal measure. In the following days, the battle intensified. American troops clawed their way up cliffs, stormed frozen gullies, and navigated treacherous lava fields, encountering hidden machine gun nests and booby traps. Calloway's hands were raw from gripping his rifle, his body screaming from exhaustion. Yet he pressed on, driven by instinct and the quiet promise of survival. Harris flew reconnaissance missions through the fog, dodging anti-aircraft fire and navigating by memory and compass, alone. The Aleutians demanded everything from men who had already given too much: courage, endurance, and the unshakable belief that survival was possible even when all seemed lost. By late June, the Americans had secured Attu. The cost had been immense. The island was a graveyard of frozen soldiers, shattered weapons, and scarred terrain. Yet the men survived, battered and bloodied, standing on the cliffs, staring out at the turbulent sea, knowing they had done something extraordinary in a corner of the world that no one else would remember. There were no headlines, no parades, no medals beyond the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. In the distance, fog and wind masked the sound of the waves, but amidst the isolation and silence, the men felt something rare, triumph, hard-won and pure, in a war that the world had almost forgotten. Years later, when veterans spoke of the Aleutians, they spoke not of glory, but of endurance. They remembered the wind, the mud, the cold, and the relentless gray fog that had tested them in ways no other battlefield could. They remembered each other, the bonds forged in mud and ice, in the face of an enemy as stubborn as the terrain itself. And they remembered the islands, silent witnesses to a hidden war, where courage and resilience had prevailed against impossible odds. The Aleutians would remain in history as America's hidden front, a testament to the men who fought not for fame, but because the world needed them to, and survival alone was enough to make heroes. The wind never seemed to sleep in the Aleutians. Even as the Americans claimed Attu, the islands demanded vigilance. Frost formed along the edges of tents, mud clung stubbornly to boots, and the fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the cliffs and valleys in a silent, impenetrable gray. Lieutenant Harris returned from another reconnaissance flight, the F-4F Wildcat rattling with every gust. The plane had survived another mission, but barely. Ice had formed on the wings mid-flight, and the engines had coughed and sputtered as if voicing their own protest. Harris climbed down from the cockpit, hands numb, and saw Sergeant Calloway leaning against a supply crate, wiping condensation from his rifle scope. "You saw it out there?" Calloway asked, eyes scanning the horizon. "Every ridge," Harris said, shivering. "And every trap. They're dug in deep. Kiska's going to be worse." Calloway nodded, knowing it was true. The Japanese defenders were as meticulous as the terrain was merciless. On Attu, they had fought every inch, leaving mines buried in frozen soil, machine guns hidden behind rock outcroppings, and snipers who could vanish like ghosts. Every step forward had been a test, and now the men had to prepare for Kiska, a fortress disguised in fog, reinforced and stocked with men who had nothing left to lose. In the evenings, after the men had eaten their canned rations and huddled around meager fires, they shared stories to keep themselves sane. Harris wrote in his journal, sketching maps of ridges and noting enemy positions, while Calloway and his squad mates whispered about home, faraway towns and family faces that seemed almost imaginary in this endless gray world. A bitter camaraderie had formed, stronger than any training or doctrine, a bond forged in mud, wind, and fear. Each man carried the memories of the men they had lost. Yet they moved forward, because retreat was not an option, and in the Aleutians, survival demanded relentless resolve. Meanwhile, across the islands, Japanese soldiers hunkered in their frozen foxholes, their fingers stiff with cold, breath visible in the morning air. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka peered through binoculars at the advancing Americans, calculating their movements. Supplies were limited, morale strained, yet they had been taught to fight with unwavering discipline. They knew the land as well as the Americans knew it, not at all. Tanaka watched the fog roll over the cliffs, masking the silent advance of men who would not be stopped by anything but death. He adjusted his grip on his rifle, feeling the weight of duty press upon his shoulders. He, too, believed in honor and survival, though it would take everything he had just to endure the coming assaults. The Americans advanced through Kiska's approaches with cautious determination. Supply lines were tenuous, the ground unforgiving, and every step seemed to conspire against them. Mud sucked at boots, icy streams cut paths through valleys, and hidden pitfalls waited beneath the fog. Sergeant Calloway led a small squad along a ridge, moving silently, every sense alert. Then the first shots rang out, sharp, deadly, cutting through the dense mist. Bullets chewed through rocks and dirt, pinging against helmets and armor. Men dove for cover, hearts racing, lungs screaming against the wind. Harris swooped overhead in his reconnaissance plane, dropping flares to illuminate the Japanese positions, the light bouncing off jagged rocks and casting long, eerie shadows across the battlefield. The battle stretched on for hours. Every foot gained cost lives, yet the men of the 7th Infantry and the supporting air crews pushed forward. Calloway crawled through mud, dodging fire, reaching the edge of a fortified trench. Smoke from small explosions mixed with the fog, making it impossible to see clearly. Yet instinct guided his actions. He threw grenades, signaling his squad to advance, and together they cleared the first line of defense. On the cliffs above, Harris directed bombing runs, adjusting for wind that shifted unpredictably, each burst of ordnance ripping through enemy positions, creating chaos and openings for the men below. By nightfall, the Americans had gained significant ground, but at a tremendous cost. The Aleutian wind howled through the broken cliffs, carrying the cries of the wounded and the echoes of gunfire across the deserted valleys. Fires burned, black, smoke curling into the heavy fog, and the men huddled where they could, tending the injured and counting the cost of every step forward. Lieutenant Harris wrote notes in his journal by lantern light, the words smeared by moisture. Every ridge, every rock, every shadow. This place will not forgive mistakes. Yet we survive because we must. Every man alive is proof that the Aleutians do not break the will of those who fight them. The following days were a test of endurance unlike any the men had known. Storms rolled in without warning, pelting men with rain and sleet, freezing mud forming into slick, treacherous ice. Supply drops were scattered by wind, often landing in unreachable ravines, leaving soldiers to improvise with what they had. Communication was limited. Signals were lost in the storm, radios drowned by static and wind. Yet amidst this unrelenting struggle, moments of humanity shone. Soldiers shared meager rations, bandaged each other's wounds, and whispered encouragement to keep moving. They learned to trust instinct over orders, knowing that survival in the Aleutians demanded more than strategy. It demanded courage, tempered by adaptability. Harris continued to fly reconnaissance missions, each sortie more dangerous than the last. From the air, the islands seemed almost indifferent to human conflict. Rocks jutting from icy seas, black lava fields stretching into the mist, glaciers gleaming under fleeting sunlight. Yet in that harsh beauty, he saw the determination of the EE men below, and he understood that victory in this hidden war required more than courage. It required endurance, ingenuity, and an unshakable will to survive. By the end of the campaign, the Japanese had been forced to evacuate Kiska under the cover of fog and subterfuge, leaving behind weapons, fortifications, and memories of a struggle the world would never fully know. The Americans had claimed the WWII islands, yet the cost was etched into every man's body and mind. Soldiers stood on cliffs overlooking the foggy ocean, battered, exhausted, yet filled with a quiet pride. They had faced the fury of nature and the enemy alike, surviving where many might have perished. The Aleutians would remain a forgotten front in the annals of history, yet for those who fought there, the memory of ice-laden cliffs, relentless fog, and the cries of comrades would never fade. Harris and Calloway returned home, carrying with them the silent testament of endurance, the knowledge that courage often goes unnoticed, and that the hardest battles are not always the ones the world remembers. In the Aleutians, men discovered that heroism was not always celebrated, but it was real, forged in mud, ice, and the unrelenting wind of a hidden war. Days bled into nights as the men of the Aleutian Campaign pressed forward. The fog never lifted fully. It crept along the ridges and valleys like a living thing, obscuring paths and hiding dangers. Every step forward demanded absolute attention. Lieutenant Harris checked his maps again, noting the twisted gullies and ice-choked streams that had to be crossed. Men stumbled in the mud, their boots heavy with frozen sludge, and some fell silent, not from injury, but from the sheer exhaustion of surviving in a place that felt determined to kill them. Sergeant Calloway moved along the ridge with his squad, scanning every shadow and crevice. The Japanese were cunning, leaving traps and snipers in unexpected places. A sudden crack, a rifle shot, echoed off the cliffs. Calloway dropped, pulling two of his men down with him. Another shot tore through the fog a few feet away, splintering a tree. The men froze, hearts pounding. Then, in unison, they returned fire, advancing cautiously, inch by inch, until the enemy position was neutralized. Harris flew overhead, engines straining against the wind. From the air, the scale of the Aleutians became terrifyingly clear. Jagged cliffs plunging into icy waters, frozen rivers that shifted unpredictably, and dense forests that could hide an entire company of men. He radioed coordinates for artillery, support, adjusting for wind gusts that could send shells miles off target. Each mission was a gamble. One wrong calculation could kill his own troops. But he had learned to trust instinct as much as instruments. At night, the men huddled in foxholes or beneath makeshift tents, their faces illuminated by flickering lanterns. Frost coated the edges of canvas and metal alike. Letters from home were read aloud, and for a moment the fog seemed to lift from their hearts. They shared stories of loved ones and old towns, laughter mingling with the moan of the wind. Harris wrote again in his journal, "The Aleutians teach you that survival is not about glory. It's about grit, about keeping moving when the world around you seems determined to freeze your soul." In the Japanese encampments, Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka observed the Americans with growing unease. Supplies were dwindling, and the relentless weather was claiming more men than bullets ever could. Every day brought a new test of endurance. Yet the Americans pressed on, learning the land faster than the defenders could anticipate. Tanaka realized that it was not just the men's weapons or training that made them formidable. It was their adaptability. They adjusted to the mud, the wind, and the fog with an almost unnatural persistence. On one particularly brutal morning, a sudden snowstorm enveloped the ridge where Calloway's squad advanced. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Men slipped, fell, and scrambled to maintain formation. The Japanese fired sporadically, taking advantage of the obscured sightlines. Calloway shouted orders over the wind, coordinating movements as Harris circled above, trying to guide artillery without being blinded by whiteout. Every decision was a matter of life and death, yet the Americans pushed through, relying on training, instinct, and sheer stubbornness. By mid-afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking Kiska's main supply depot. Smoke still rose from American airstrikes, and the Japanese defenders had retreated into the interior of the island, leaving only snipers and booby traps behind. Calloway's men paused, surveying the devastation and exhaustion etched on their own faces. They had come far, survived more than they imagined possible. Yet the battle was far from over. Harris landed his Wildcat on a temporary airstrip carved from the tundra, mud clinging to the wheels. The men gathered around, sharing a moment of relief before preparing for the final push. The Aleutians had tested them in ways that no one in the continental United States could imagine. Freezing rain, hidden snipers, collapsing cliffs, and a fog that swallowed entire platoons. Yet, in every man, there was a stubborn spark that refused to let the islands claim them. That night, as the wind howled and the fog rolled in thicker than ever, Harris and Calloway sat near a small fire, sipping lukewarm coffee from tin cups. "Do you ever think anyone back home knows what this is like?" Calloway asked, staring into the flames. Harris shook his head. "Not a chance. They'll read a few lines in the paper about a victory, maybe see a picture of a map. But they'll never know about the mud, the fog, the wind tearing through your bones." Calloway nodded, tossing another piece of driftwood into the fire. "And yet, somehow, we're still here. We made it this far. That counts for something." "More than you think," Harris said quietly. "This war, it's not just battles. It's endurance. It's survival. Every ridge we hold, every step we take through this frozen hell, that's a victory." The wind screamed around them, shaking the makeshift shelter. Somewhere in the distance, a Japanese sniper fired, the bullet whistling past and striking a tree behind them. The men flinched but didn't move. The fog and storm were relentless, but they were relentless too. In the Aleutians, survival was both a test and a triumph, and every man who made it through carried a story of courage the world would never hear. The days stretched on, each one a mirror of the last: fog, mud, wind, and rain. But the men kept moving. Supplies were low, and the Aleutians seemed determined to swallow anyone foolish enough to linger. Harris circled overhead in his Wildcat, reporting enemy positions and spotting gaps in the Japanese defenses. Every man on the ground relied on his eyes as much as their own instincts. Calloway's squad moved through a narrow pass, ice-covered rocks jutting like teeth. The snow had melted in patches, turning the ground to a treacherous slurry that sucked at boots and weapons alike. Sniper fire cracked from the cliffs above. A soldier screamed as a bullet ricocheted dangerously close, and Calloway threw himself forward, dragging a private into the shallow cover of a rocky outcrop. "We can't stay here," he shouted over the wind. "Move fast! Stay low!" The men scrambled, careful to keep spacing between them. Every step was a gamble. They reached a ridge overlooking the enemy camp, a collection of huts and tents, with Japanese flags whipping in the wind. Smoke still curled from several burning supply caches from previous air raids. The Japanese defenders were fewer than expected, likely fatigued and malnourished from weeks of constant harassment by the Americans and the merciless weather. "Lieutenant, artillery?" Calloway asked, keeping his eyes on the enemy. Harris's voice crackled over the radio. "Coordinates set. Stand by. And wait for the wind shift." The snow swirled violently, and the men hugged the ground. Seconds later, the roar of cannons shattered the silence. Explosions rippled across the camp, sending wooden shacks splintering and Japanese soldiers scrambling. The Americans advanced, moving methodically through the wreckage. Each hut cleared revealed more signs of human struggle. Empty rations, letters, personal effects. Sergeant Tanaka, a Japanese corporal captured weeks earlier, had warned of potential traps. But the Americans moved with caution, trusting in training honed through the unforgiving terrain. By late afternoon, they had reached the center of the island. The Japanese commander's forces had either retreated or surrendered, exhausted and beaten by the relentless combination of weather, geography, and American persistence. The Aleutians, once considered a forgotten front, were now firmly under U.S. control. The men stood on the ridge, surveying the desolate beauty of the islands. Rugged cliffs, endless fog, and snow-capped peaks that seemed almost to mourn the human suffering they had witnessed. Harris landed his plane nearby, the engine whining against the icy wind. Calloway and the men gathered around, faces etched with fatigue and disbelief at having survived. No medals awaited them, no triumphant bands played, just the deafening silence of the wind and the slow realization that they had accomplished the impossible. That night, around small fires scattered across the island, men wrote letters, cleaned their weapons, and shared stories. Some laughed quietly, others stared into the darkness, haunted by what they had seen. Harris pulled out his journal, pen, scratching against paper as he described the fog, the mud, the relentless cold, and the resilience of men who refused to yield. "They'll never understand," Calloway muttered, tossing a small piece of driftwood into the fire. "Not in New York, not in Washington. They'll read a line about a victory in the Aleutians and move on. But this was hell." Harris nodded. "And yet, we survived. Every ridge we held, every step we took, it mattered. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it had to be done." Somewhere in the distance, the faint glow of the northern lights danced across the sky, painting the snow and fog in ethereal colors. For the first time in weeks, the men felt a strange kind of peace. The Aleutians had tested them beyond imagination, but they had endured. In the coming days, the remaining Japanese soldiers surrendered quietly, and the Americans began to organize supply lines and establish temporary outposts. News from Washington remained sparse, little more than brief mentions in official dispatches. Yet the men of the Aleutian Campaign carried the memory of their victories silently, knowing the world might never fully appreciate the sacrifice and endurance it had required. Harris looked out over the island, wind biting at his face. "History may forget this place," he said softly, "but we'll remember. Every step, every frozen mile, every life lost and saved. We'll carry it with us." Calloway nodded, gripping his rifle. "Then let's make sure the world can't erase it completely. One story at a time." The Aleutians may have been America's hidden front, but for those who fought there, the battle was unforgettable, etched into their bones, their minds, and their souls. And though the fog would continue to roll across the islands long after the war ended, the courage, endurance, and resolve of the men who fought there would shine far brighter than any mist. The weeks after the battle were quiet, in a way that felt unnatural. The Aleutian Islands, once a theater of constant fire and movement, now seemed to exhale, a fragile pause in the chaos of war. The men patrolled cautiously, ever wary of hidden mines or unexploded ordnance left behind by the retreating Japanese. Supplies were still limited, and the cold bit relentlessly at fingers and faces, but the morale had shifted. Victory, though muted, had a taste that lingered on the tongue. Calloway and his squad moved across the ridge to inspect a recently abandoned Japanese bunker. Inside, frost covered the walls, and remnants of ration packs lay scattered. Notes and crude maps, hastily left behind, revealed how carefully the Japanese had tried to hold the islands against impossible odds. It was a reminder that even in retreat, the enemy had fought with determination. Harris landed nearby in his Wildcat, its engine whining against the icy wind. He jumped down and joined the squad, carrying a small crate of supplies. "Looks like they left a lot behind," he said, peering into the bunker. "Not much of a fight left here, but we can at least gather intel before the cleanup crew arrives." Calloway nodded. "Every piece counts. These islands are a gold mine of information. Maps, journals, weapons, even a few personal letters. Gives you a sense of who they were, not just what they were fighting for." The men spent the afternoon documenting and cataloging everything they could carry. They moved carefully, aware that a misstep could send them tumbling down a frozen slope or into hidden traps. The cold and wind made even simple tasks exhausting, but there was a quiet satisfaction in working methodically, rebuilding some sense of order from the chaos of war. As night fell, the northern lights painted the sky in ghostly greens and purples. The men gathered around small fires, the crackle of burning driftwood a rare comfort against the roar of the wind. Calloway pulled out a small notebook, jotting down notes about the day's finds and the movements of the enemy. Harris, sitting nearby, cleaned his rifle while watching the dancing lights above. "You think anyone back home will ever understand what this place is like?" Calloway asked, voice barely audible over the wind. Harris shook his head. "Maybe not. Aleutians, it's a hidden war. The papers barely mention it, and the cities thousands of miles away don't see the snow, the mud, the fog, or the men who froze half to death just to take a hill. But that doesn't matter. We know what we did, and that's enough." Silence fell over the group for a few moments, each man lost in his own thoughts. Ghostly fog drifted across the ridge, curling around rocks and trees like a living thing. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of artillery, fire, remnants of a skirmish hours earlier, faded into the night. Then Calloway spoke again, softer this time. "We fought here, and no one will sing about it. But we left something behind. Not just the Americans' flag, but proof that a fight like this, it's worth something. Every life, every step, every frozen mile. It mattered." Harris nodded, finally letting himself lean back against a rock. "And when someone finally writes about this place, they'll see it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday." The wind howled over the ridge, carrying the sound of distant waves crashing against the rocky shores below. In that quiet, the men of the Aleutian Campaign felt the weight of survival and the strange relief of an unfinished war. They had won, but the islands themselves seemed to claim a piece of every soul that had fought there. Calloway stared out over the horizon, the fog and lights blending into one endless expanse. "I guess history doesn't always need an audience," he said, almost to himself. "Sometimes it just needs witnesses." Harris smiled faintly. "Then we'll be the witnesses. And maybe, one day, someone will listen." The firelight flickered, shadows dancing across frost-covered faces. Somewhere between the fog, snow, and the endless waves, the Aleutian Islands held the memory of struggle, endurance, and quiet heroism. And as long as the men who had survived remembered, the story of America's hidden front would never truly be lost. Spring was slowly creeping across the Aleutians, though it felt more like a trick than a promise. The snow melted in patches, revealing mud that clung to boots and blankets alike. The wind never stopped, never relented, and the bitter cold was still a constant companion. Calloway and his men were assigned to secure abandoned outposts, making sure that no Japanese forces could return to reclaim the islands. Every bunker, every trench, every frozen hillside was inspected, catalogued, and mapped. It was tedious work, but in a way, it was healing, turning the chaos of battle into order. One morning, Calloway hiked up a jagged ridge to survey the coastline. He could see the ocean stretching into fog, waves slapping the rocks far below. A group of Aleutian locals had begun returning to their villages, tents and huts once abandoned, now slowly rebuilt. Children ran along the shore, laughing, their voices carrying over the wind. It was a surreal sight. After months of blood and fire, life was quietly reclaiming the islands. "Lieutenant!" Harris called, waving from below. He had stumbled across a small crate of Japanese supplies, medical kits, canned rations, and even a few personal effects. "You'll want to see this." Calloway descended and opened the crate. Inside were letters, diaries, and photographs. He picked up one photo, a young Japanese soldier smiling at the camera, a fishing rod in hand. It was impossible to imagine him months ago, entrenched and firing on American troops. Calloway felt a pang of something he hadn't expected. The strange, heavy weight of empathy. "That's what makes this war so strange," Harris muttered. "We fought against real people, with families and homes, and now all that's left are memories in boxes like this." They spent the day sorting through the materials, careful to document everything. Calloway wrote in his journal about the soldiers he had faced, the landscapes he had traversed, and the quiet resilience of the Aleutian Islands themselves. Each hill and valley seemed to carry the echoes of every footstep, every gunshot, every scream and shout from the battle. By evening, they gathered near a small fire, smoke curling into the pink-tinted fog. Harris pulled out a harmonica and played a slow, haunting tune. The others listened, letting the music fill the spaces left by war. Even the Aleutian wind seemed to soften, as if pausing to listen. Calloway thought about how the world would remember, or rather, fail to remember, this campaign. The Aleutians had been called America's forgotten front, a battle fought in silence, against harsh weather, and an enemy whose determination matched their own. No grand parades, no celebratory headlines, just the steady, relentless push to reclaim territory and preserve life. "We'll tell it," Calloway said quietly, almost to himself. "Not for medals, not for recognition, but so the men who fought here, everyone who froze, bled, and survived, aren't forgotten." Harris nodded. "And someday, maybe the world will understand why we risked everything on these frozen rocks and foggy shores." The wind whipped again, louder this time, and the fog rolled in from the sea. The firelight flickered across their faces, shadows dancing like ghosts. Calloway stared into the haze and thought of the soldiers who would never return, the ones buried beneath the snow and mud. He thought of the survivors, the locals who had endured, and the strange, quiet victory that would remain largely unknown. But in that moment, sitting in the Aleutian twilight, he understood something profound. The war had been fought not just for territory, but for the fragile, stubborn endurance of humanity itself. And as long as those who witnessed it remembered, even in silence, the story of the Aleutians would live on. The following weeks blurred into one another. Calloway's unit moved steadily along the ragged coastline, inspecting abandoned Japanese positions, dismantling booby traps, and marking out strategic points for American occupation. The Aleutians were a cruel teacher. The wind was relentless, slicing through layers of clothing as if no garment could ever truly protect you. The fog rolled in and out like a living thing, swallowing men and hills in equal measure. Soldiers spoke little, conserving energy for the trek, their boots caked in mud and thawing snow. Yet, despite the harshness, there were moments that pierced the monotony, quiet, almost imperceptible glimpses of life reclaiming the islands. A small fox darted across a ridge one morning, pausing to stare at them with unafraid curiosity before disappearing into the rocks. One of the men, Corporal Simmons, swore he saw a pair of bald eagles perched on a dead tree, wings spread, surveying the land as if they were generals of the wilderness. Calloway looked up, and for a moment allowed himself a sense of awe, marveling at the island's silent, indifferent beauty. The Aleutians had been scorched by the war. Buildings were splintered, docks twisted, and frozen mounds of earth marked the scars of bombardments. Yet amid the destruction, life crept stubbornly back. Moss covered rocks that had been blackened by fire. Lichens clung to ruined walls. Small wildflowers, pink and yellow, pushed through cracks in the mud. There was an eerie peace in it, a quiet assertion that life would endure, long after the men and the guns had gone. One afternoon, Calloway and his men were mapping a small cove that had once housed a Japanese observation post. The fog was particularly thick, swallowing the horizon and making distance almost meaningless. As they approached the site, Calloway noticed something half buried in the mud. A small, weathered crate, partially rotted, but intact. He pried it open and found a collection of letters, diaries, and sketches. Japanese handwriting, careful, precise, filled the pages. He knelt down, gingerly flipping through the papers. Each page was a window into a life that had existed in parallel to their own suffering, a reminder that the enemy was not just a faceless machine, but human beings with hopes, fears, and families. One sketch caught his eye. A delicate watercolor of the cove they were standing in, waves lapping against jagged rocks, a single ship moored in the distance. It was beautiful, almost painfully so, and Calloway felt a strange kinship with the hand that had made it. Harris leaned over his shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "Makes you wonder," he said quietly. "All this fighting, all this death, and they were just people too." Calloway nodded, closing the diary and setting it carefully aside. "That's the thing about war," he said. "It's easy to forget the people behind the uniforms. But if we remember, maybe it makes us better somehow." The next few days were occupied with clearing and securing the cove. Men worked methodically, setting up temporary observation posts and reinforcing crumbling structures with sandbags. The wind drove a chill straight into the bones, and even seasoned soldiers found themselves shivering despite layers of clothing. Meals were taken in shifts, steaming cans of beef and rice barely warming the stomachs that had gone cold from the relentless weather. One evening, as they sat huddled near a small fire, Calloway noticed the first flickers of the northern lights. They danced across the sky in muted shades of green and violet, a ghostly spectacle that contrasted starkly with the blackened rocks below. For a few moments, all the men were silent, watching in awe. The war seemed distant then, as if the aurora had drawn a curtain between them and the destruction that had consumed the islands for months. "Never thought I'd see anything like that here," muttered Private Kelly, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "Makes the hell of it worth it." Somehow, Calloway only nodded. He didn't try to articulate what he felt. Words would have seemed inadequate. In that moment, the Aleutians weren't just a battlefield. They were a living, breathing world, indifferent to human strife, yet capable of breathtaking beauty. The following morning brought bad news. A patrol had encountered a small band of Japanese soldiers who had been hiding in the hills, survivors who had evaded capture for months. Calloway's unit prepared to engage, mindful of the dangers. They approached quietly, moving along ridges and through gullies, the fog thick enough to obscure even a few feet ahead. When they came upon the enemy, it was a tense standoff. Both sides froze, weapons raised, eyes meeting across the cold, wet terrain. A shot rang out, startling in the heavy silence, but it was accidental. A ricochet that skittered across the rocks. Immediately, both sides ducked and took cover. Calloway called for a halt. "Hold your fire!" he shouted. We don't need to start killing when we can take them alive. It was a delicate negotiation. Words were shouted across the ridge in halting Japanese, answered in broken English by Calloway and his men. Slowly, cautiously, the Japanese soldiers lowered their rifles, hands raised. Relief washed over Calloway as he realized they would take the men prisoner without bloodshed. Later, as the prisoners were escorted to camp, Calloway reflected on the strange dichotomy of war in the Aleutians. Here, the environment was often a greater enemy than the people they were fighting. Starvation, exposure, frostbite, and the ever-present wind had killed as surely as bullets. And yet, there were moments when understanding and empathy prevailed, when the soldiers could see each other not as enemies, but as men struggling to survive in a harsh, indifferent world. Weeks passed. The Aleutians, once a battlefield of fire and fear, slowly began to feel like a place of cautious peace. The American soldiers, hardened by combat and exhaustion, began to adapt to the rhythm of the islands. They built sturdier shelters, learned which paths through the fog were safest, and discovered ways to fish and forage, supplementing their rations with what the land and sea offered. Local Aleutian villagers returned as well, helping with supplies, sharing knowledge of the terrain, and bringing a faint sense of normalcy to a place that had been consumed by war. Calloway found himself thinking often about what they had endured, and about how easily the story of this campaign could be forgotten. The Battle of the Aleutians had never been glamorous. It was overshadowed by campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. Few newspapers had reported on it, and fewer still would write about it in history books. Yet the sacrifices made here were real, the endurance monumental, and the lessons learned invaluable. One afternoon, Calloway and Harris took a boat to a small island to inspect an abandoned airstrip. The wind was ferocious, tearing at their jackets and pushing waves against the hull. As they approached, the remnants of Japanese fortifications came into view. Trenches, gun emplacements, and rusting machinery, all half swallowed by moss and earth. It was a graveyard of war, yet also a testament to human persistence. Walking along the runway, Calloway found an old, half-buried plane, its fuselage cracked and weathered by time. It was a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, forgotten and abandoned. He ran his fingers along the cold metal, imagining the men who had flown it, the missions they had undertaken, and the fear and courage that had accompanied each flight. "This place," he said quietly, "it carries every story, every life. You can almost hear them if you listen." Harris nodded, a somber expression on his face. "And most people will never know. This will all be forgotten." Calloway shook his head. "Not if we write it down. Not if we tell it. Someone has to remember the Aleutians, the wind, the mud, the snow, the men who fought and died here." That night, back at camp, Calloway began writing in his journal. He recorded every patrol, every skirmish, every small victory and defeat. He wrote about the harsh winds that cut like knives, the snowstorms that left men immobile for hours, and the relentless fog that turned hills into labyrinths. But he also wrote about the moments of humanity, the rescued prisoners, the local villagers returning, the fleeting glimpses of beauty in the northern lights, or the cries of gulls overhead. As the weeks turned into months, the Aleutians slowly returned to a form of peace. The American presence remained, maintaining order and ensuring no remnants of the Japanese forces could return. Soldiers rotated back to the mainland, and those who stayed continued to patrol and fortify positions, their routines blending into the rhythm of survival. Calloway often stood alone on a ridge at sunset, looking out over the islands. The fog rolled in from the sea, and the snow melted into mud, and yet he felt a strange sense of triumph. They had endured. They had survived. They had reclaimed the land, not through grand gestures or heroic charges, but through quiet perseverance, determination, and an unyielding respect for the life that existed beyond the battlefield. The Aleutians remained, as they always had, indifferent to men and wars. But the stories of those who had fought there, of the hardships endured and the humanity discovered, would linger in the hearts and minds of those who remembered. And Callaway knew that even if the rest of the world forgot, the islands themselves would always hold the echoes of those who had come, fought, and survived. In the end, the Aleutian Campaign was not defined by headlines, medals, or propaganda. It was defined by resilience, adaptation, and the quiet, relentless courage of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Callaway closed his journal and looked out at the fading light over the foggy waters, knowing that somewhere in the wind, the story of the forgotten war in Alaska would carry on, unseen, unheard, but never truly lost. Winter was beginning to loosen its grip on the islands when Callaway received orders to prepare for rotation back to the mainland. The news was met with quiet relief among the men, though there was an unspoken sadness in leaving behind the land that had become both tormentor and teacher. The fog, that had been a constant companion all winter, seemed almost to linger longer that morning, as if reluctant to let them go. Packing was slow. Every man moved with careful precision, salvaging what could be carried and leaving behind what could not. The barracks, once bustling with the low hum of conversation and the occasional laughter, were now eerily still. The air carried the tang of salt, mud, and the lingering smoke from last night's fires. Callaway took a final walk through the camp, passing the observation posts and the trenches that had been dug with hands blistered and numb from cold. He stopped at a small grave site near the edge of the camp, where a wooden cross marked the resting place of Private Daniels. Taken by exposure during a supply run in late December, Callaway knelt briefly, tracing the name etched into the rough wood. "We'll remember," he whispered. "All of it." The journey back to the mainland was a stark contrast to the isolation and harshness of the Aleutians. The ship's deck was crowded with soldiers, many sleeping, others staring at the endless horizon. Waves crashed against the hull, sending cold sprays over the deck, but no storm could rival the one they had endured on the islands. Callaway found himself thinking about the Japanese soldiers they had captured, the villagers they had met, and the quiet moments of humanity that had punctuated the relentless hardships. Even among the roar of the sea and the wind, memories of the islands lingered. He recalled the time they had stumbled upon an abandoned village, houses half swallowed by snow and moss, and discovered a lone Aleutian woman who had stayed behind. She had fed them fish and pointed out safe paths through the treacherous cliffs, speaking in a mix of broken English and native Aleut words. There had been no malice, only the shared understanding of survival. When they finally reached the port at anchorage, the men were met with a semblance of normalcy that almost felt alien. The air was warmer, the land solid underfoot, and the bustle of soldiers and civilians alike was a shock to senses honed to isolation and fog. Callaway felt an odd sense of dislocation, as if the Aleutians had shaped him into someone who no longer belonged entirely in this world. Reassignment orders followed quickly. Some men were sent to Europe, others to the Pacific. Callaway was assigned to a staff position, overseeing training for new soldiers being sent to the Northern Front. Yet even in this role, his mind often wandered back to the islands, the jagged cliffs, the frozen winds, the endless fog, and the quiet courage of the men who had survived there. Letters arrived sporadically from fellow soldiers who had remained behind. Accounts of small skirmishes, encounters with wildlife, and the ongoing struggle against the elements painted a picture of a land that was never truly tamed, even after the war. Callaway wrote back carefully, recounting nothing of the most harrowing moments, choosing instead to share stories of resilience, of unexpected camaraderie, and of the fragile beauty that existed amidst the devastation. Years passed. Callaway returned to civilian life, taking up a modest role in the civil service, But the Aleutians never left him. In quiet moments, he could close his eyes and feel the wind slicing through the fog, hear the distant cries of gulls, and see the glint of frost on jagged rocks. He carried with him the weight of the campaign, not as a burden but as a testament to endurance and the quiet heroism that had gone unnoticed by the wider world. Historians would later call the Aleutian Campaign a forgotten front, overshadowed by the battles in Europe and the Pacific Islands. But for those who had been there, every frozen hill, every treacherous cove, and every moment of life clinging to the edge of survival was indelibly etched into memory. The war had been a crucible, and the men of the Aleutians had emerged forged not by glory or recognition, but by the simple act of surviving with dignity in a land that demanded nothing less. Occasionally, Callaway would meet other veterans from the Aleutians, and in their eyes there was an unspoken understanding. No medals, no parades, no headlines could capture what they had endured. They spoke of fog so thick it erased distance, of snowdrifts taller than men, of nights spent shivering in lean-tos that offered little protection from wind-driven rain. Yet they also spoke of triumph, small victories over nature, over fear, and over despair. And in those moments, they knew that though history might forget, they would never forget each other or the land that had tested them in ways no one else could understand. Callaway kept a journal, filled with sketches of the islands, maps of patrol routes, and the names of men who had died or endured alongside him. He wrote of the Japanese diaries they had found, the foxes and eagles, the northern lights, and the fleeting moments of beauty amidst the hardship. He wrote so that when the world finally turned its attention to the Aleutians, it would know that the war there had been fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with resilience, ingenuity, and an enduring spirit. In the twilight of his life, Callaway returned once more to Alaska, retracing the paths he had walked decades earlier. The islands had changed. The forests had reclaimed some of the ruined villages. The snow melted into spring rivers, but the spirit of the land remained. Standing on a cliff, overlooking the gray expanse of water, he felt a profound sense of closure. The Aleutians had tested him, humbled him, and shaped him. And in that quiet, cold, and beautiful land, he finally understood what it meant to endure. Not for glory, but for survival, for memory, and for the men who had shared the struggle with him. The Aleutian Islands remained, as they always had, indifferent to men and wars. Yet for those who had been there, they held stories that would never truly die. Stories of courage found in the fog, of humanity preserved in the face of hardship, and of the quiet victories that went unseen by the world. The Battle of the Aleutians had been forgotten by most, but it had forged men who would never forget. And in their memories, the islands lived on, silent witnesses to the resilience of the human spirit. Decades later, the Aleutian Islands remained remote, their cliffs jagged, their skies often shrouded in mist, and their waters cold and unyielding. Yet the memory of the men who had fought there endured quietly, woven into the land itself. Veterans returned occasionally, now older, slower, their bodies carrying the aches and scars of a lifetime, but their minds alive with the clarity and intensity of the days spent in fog, wind, and snow. Callaway, now in his 70s, walked along a shoreline he had first seen as a young man, the gray waves lapping at his boots. The wind bit through his coat, cold and unrelenting, yet somehow familiar, almost comforting. He thought of the men who had fallen, of Daniels, of Sergeant Halverson, and of countless others whose names might never appear in books or newspapers. Their courage had been silent, their victories unheralded, yet it had mattered in ways the world would never fully see. The Aleutians had tested every limit, physical, mental, and moral. They had stripped men to their bare essence, leaving them to confront not just the enemy, but themselves, their fears, and their capacity for endurance. Calloway remembered the long nights listening to the wind howl across the ridges, the sharp cries of gulls, and the quiet camaraderie of men huddled together against the cold. Those moments, harsh as they were, had also been moments of humanity, the forging of trust, respect, and unspoken bonds that war could never break. He knelt near a small cairn he had built years ago, stones carefully balanced to mark the passage of those he had lost. A simple gesture, but one heavy with memory. He traced his fingers over the cold rocks and whispered their names into the wind, knowing that in some way the islands themselves carried those voices now. The fog swirled around him, a familiar shroud, and for a moment the years fell away. He could see the camps, the cliffs, the supply routes carved from the rock, and hear again the hum of the wind through the hills like an echo of the past. The Aleutian Campaign had been overshadowed, forgotten by most of the world, but it had shaped history in quiet ways. Every map plotted, every supply depot located, every small skirmish and patrol had contributed to a greater war effort, proving that even in the most hidden and inhospitable corners of the world, courage and perseverance mattered. Calloway understood now that it was not glory that defined these men, but their steadfastness, the quiet refusal to surrender to the cold, the fog, or the overwhelming odds. In the small museum at Anchorage, displays told the story of the Aleutians for the first time. Photographs, maps, and artifacts slowly gave the campaign its place in history. Visitors could see the P-38s and F-5 Lightnings that had flown reconnaissance missions, the trucks that had crawled across mud and ice, and the letters home that captured moments of humanity in a war defined by destruction. Yet it was the stories of the men, their humor, ingenuity, and endurance that resonated most. They had fought a hidden war, and now, finally, the world began to remember. Calloway stood at the edge of the museum exhibit, watching young cadets trace their fingers over maps of the islands, imagining the frozen winds and the relentless fog. He smiled faintly, knowing they could never fully understand the full weight of the campaign. But he also knew the spirit of those men would live on, in their curiosity, their questions, and the respect they gave to the land and those who had endured its trials. The Aleutians had been a crucible, shaping men, testing limits, and proving that courage often comes not from headlines or medals, but from enduring the unseen battles with steadfast hearts. Calloway turned from the exhibit, feeling the weight of history settle gently on his shoulders. The islands, quiet and indifferent, would outlast everyone who had walked their shores. Yet in their silence, they carried the echoes of heroism, of sacrifice, and of resilience. As the sun set behind the Alaskan mountains, painting the sky in crimson and gold, Calloway whispered into the wind, "We were here, we endured, we remembered." The Aleutians had claimed much: men, comfort, and time. But they had also given something enduring: the knowledge that even in the harshest and most forgotten places, humanity could survive, adapt, and leave a mark that time could not erase. The story of the Forgotten War was not one of grand victories or dramatic battles, but of quiet endurance, unrecognized heroism, and the simple, powerful truth that even in the most remote and inhospitable corners of the world, men could endure, and through that endurance, the tide of history could be quietly, irrevocably changed, and so the Aleutians waited, their cliffs jagged and winds relentless, but beneath the fog and snow, the memories of those who had fought and survived endured, a testament to resilience, courage, and the unbroken human spirit.